Okay, thank you so much for, well, having me tonight and letting me give this presentation about a topic that's very dear to me. And I'll introduce you in it all and talk about women. But I thought maybe perhaps it's easiest to start at my beginning where I started my research. It's in this cinema in Amsterdam. Whenever you come to visit, well, stop by. It's a pretty chaotic but nice place to go. Very cheap for students mainly. It's a completely student-run cinema. It still looks the same as you'll see on this picture. This is a picture of 46. And 45, we have Gone with the Wind. Of course, it was already out in America way earlier, but because of the war, there were so many movies that couldn't have been seen. And well, in 45, students that were part of the resistance, and they had to give up their studies during the war, they thought, well, how can we, I don't know, continue our lives after all of this, what happened? And they thought about, well, uh, organizing a cinema. And it's still here 80 years later. And it's still completely student run, just at like back then in 45. And it was me that started working there when I was a student in history at the University of Amsterdam as well. And I had no idea about the history that was in this place, but it all started here. You can see it used to be this old cinema with wooden chairs that were horrible to sit on, but everyone did it anyway after the war. Everyone was excited to go to the movies again. They changed it after 1 year, but it's still the same room that I used to work at as well. And there was this one question at some point. It's an interesting structure, the organization of this cinema, because it's a non-hierarchical, completely democratic idea. Very idealistic, and I think, well, suited when you think about the students that were part of the resistance during the war and they had to come up with something new and something completely different than we had during those 5 years in the Netherlands. And well, they still run it the same way. So they have meetings every week in which they decide everything, the students. So I also was there. And at some point, there was a question if someone would like to give a presentation on the 4th or 5th of May, our liberation or commemoration day in the Netherlands. And I was the only history student there, so it came up to me. Um, and well, I was willing to do so, but I had no idea where to start. Where I knew about the one man in particular. His name is Piet Meerburg. You'll see him here on the picture because the big cinema room that you just saw a picture of was named after him. So I thought that must be something. And well, he was quite a famous man because he was part of like a lot of cultural institutions in the Netherlands and was really, really great. And he used to be seen as the founder of Criterion, the cinema. So, well, I thought I'd start with him and his son. He was willing to talk to me, and then, well, apparently there were a lot of interviews with Piet Meerburg, and I started listening to them because apparently, according to his son, I'm quoting here, well, after some years when he was in retirement and he did some therapy because of the war, he couldn't stop talking about it anymore. So he only talked about the war after at some point. And he gave interviews about his resistance work. And I think it's nice that Jan already mentioned some of it because he was one of those people that saved the Jewish children from the daycare across the Hollandse Schouwburg. I'll come back to that later. He was kind of the organizer of the whole thing, together with a lot of other people. And he used to talk in these interviews about himself mainly. And a lot about the other men that he was working with. So Piet Meerburg himself, Wouter van Zijtveld, and like I can go on and on. And then when the interviewer asked him like, how was the group organized? And he would tell how all the men did all the amazing organizing, and then the women, he would call them the girls, they would do everything else. And everything else meant that they would literally save a child from the daycare, bring it to a family to hide there and continue going there to support them by bringing ration cards, everything they needed. So that was well, everything else. And they were only called the girls. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, but who are they? Like, what are their names and what did they do? And one of them, you'll see, you have our picture here, is Hansje van Lochem, his own wife. who he never mentions, but was a big part of his group because it turned out his group during the war was the majority of the group were women. But they were never, well, they were always called the girls, so we never knew about what they did. And I think it's nice to look back a bit to see that Piet Meerburg, his way of speaking about them wasn't something only he did, but also one of our major historians, Lou de Jong, and you see all his 12 volumes of the war in the Netherlands here. He's the same. He doesn't talk about women at all, kind of. There's sometimes the exceptions are there, but he's at some point concludes when he has this long list of men that he counts. He tries to count how many people were in the Dutch resistance, and then at some point he says, there were also women and girls there. There are no numbers. And he just
Mhm.
stops right there.
Mhm.
So I think it says a lot about how the women were seen for a very long time. This was during the 60s, 70s, but his work was very influential. And I think we still see this idea of they were there, but we don't know anything about them.
Mhm.
Luckily, as Jan was saying, there's some changes recently. I put some pictures up here of biographies that were written in the Netherlands. I think in the last 10 years mainly about women in the resistance. But as you can see, if you read the Dutch titles or see the pictures up here, it's mainly biographies. And I think that's, well, for me, it was a kind of a problem because I think looking at the women that I studied, the girls that Piet Meerburg mentioned, I studied in the end 12 women that were all part of the cinema that they founded after the war. Um, I think if you find one woman, you see a complete network. At least that's how it happened for me. I had no idea, but when I dived into it, Hansje van Lochem, for example, his wife, she was recruiting her friends to do the same work. So she had all these girlfriends that were also there. And I think with the biography, you mostly see that it's someone who's a hero or like a special figure that deserves a complete book only about her. And I think with my book, I wanted to show the world that there were so many women that were all part of the same story, that they were all, like so many women were part of the resistance.
Mhm.
Um, and I wanted to, well, show you some of them just briefly. I can't talk about everything, but to see what they did and how they use what I talk their femininity as a weapon. They were really aware of that. And I think Cinema Criterion was a great case study because it's super specific, of course. But it's men and women who work there, and we only remember the men and not the women. So it's like quite clear there. They were all students though, and they had all different kinds of backgrounds, which was nice. And they were all part of the resistance. So I knew that for sure when I started there. And I think this picture you see Isa Baschwitz, she was, well, as the Nazis would say, a half Jew. Her father was a Jew. And she helped him right away in 1940. He was from, they were originally from Germany, but they were already moved in the 1930s to Amsterdam. And I think one way she used her feminine skills, I would say, in this world there was by flirting with the German soldiers to get her across a river, by telling them that she missed her fiance, which she didn't have. And she would terribly wanted to see him, and then they would bring her over, and she'd come back with her skirt full with ration cards, and they would bring her by car towards where she wanted to be. So like already one of those great examples. And
Mhm.
I think Jan already told a lot about the role of women, so I'll go through this quite quickly. But I think it's mainly the main goal that I wanted to mention is they are in the home mainly, and motherhood was kind of the ideal in Dutch society that women should become a mother. And I think this is important to remember because the women in the resistance will use this in their complete advantage. Um,
Mhm.
Studying, which the women in my book do, is an exception. But it's interesting because it's one of the places that I think the gender roles are, well, kind of overlapping for the first time, that they're to in their lecture halls, they're together with the boys. They mix and they have their own what we call sororities now, I would say, to also unite and also see each other more often. And I think these networks of women are super interesting to, well, it's my recommendation to look at that as well. Um, this role of women is important as well because the definition of resistance is often that they have to do something that's well, very manly. So like they have to be out of the house. It should be organized and it should be probably with weapons or violence. That's like often one of the ways to define resistance. But what if we broaden that definition and see other ways as well? I think we see a lot of them, and femininity is one of them. I wanted to take you to one example to dive into this one and see, well, how she uses his feminine role. Because I think it's interesting, Jan, as well. You were saying that too. After the war, they don't really do something completely different. Like the whole society changes, but the roles are quite strict. And I think during the war, they're quite strict as well. They have their space to do something else, but usually they stick to their roles. And the good thing though is that they know how to use it instead of making them a victim of the role itself. For example, Otti Lim, she's 18 when she joins the resistance, so she's very young. She just went to high school, the Christian HBS, where she met a lot of friends, girlfriends, which are also part of her network in that resistance. And she started living at the Keizersgracht for 184, which is a home of one of the leaders of the resistance. Um, it's too specific for now, but she becomes part of the resistance because of that home. It's called the Kindergroep van Trouw. It's like the children's group of one of the illegal newspapers in the Netherlands. And what they do is, well, they're one of the groups that saves people from the crash or the daycare and the Hollandse Schouwburg. And I wanted to show you how that goes, what she did, because Ottie Lim tells about this in an interview. You can see this is the real life right now. This is the Hollandse Schouwburg. And that's where all the Jews had to report before were deported to different camps. And there was an SS officer in front of this building. On the other side, there became a daycare, I think around 1942, you could say. There was already a daycare, but they started using it for the people that were in the Hollandse Schouwburg. So all the children were in here, and we don't know why, but the Germans decided this building didn't need to be guarded, which is quite essential here. And Otti Lim would go, she would come, she could walk here. There's a school building right here. She would go into the school, and then one of the nurses would give her a child across the hedge, literally, from the school garden and the daycare garden that would be next to each other. And then when there would be a tram, it's still right here in the middle of the street. Otti would go out of the school building with the baby in her arms and walk with the tram that blocked the view from across the street. So it's like a ridiculously dangerous thing to do. And she did this at least several times. I'm sure she did it with one baby that was 10 days old. He's called Benjamin Flessendrager. And she saved him during the war. She brought him to the south of this is him. She brought him to the south of Amsterdam to her friend from high school, Nell. She's right here. And then, well, she could use this. She was someone who could use her femininity to save these lives because it would be very strange if a man would walk down the street with a baby in his arms. It was completely opposed to roles back then.
Mhm.
She saved him. He was one of a family of 64, I think, and he was the only one to survive, which is terrible, of course, but due to her work. Um, and she did this with several other children. Other ways which other women did was also faking to be pregnant. Um, they could fake to be pregnant because at some point they would register a name, a Jewish child in their name, which was
Mhm.
scandalous because they were often unmarried. So it would be well, they had to pretend, and they would always do this entire act about like how well bad they would have behaved, and like they kind of enjoyed doing that as well. But also being pregnant with ration cards. So they pretended to be pregnant to go to see the gynecologist, and then they would get out with the ration cards. This is what Marjolein Heijmans did, for example. Registering the name.
Anna,
Yeah.
Anna, may I ask you to try to bring it to a conclusion?
Yes, I will. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just wanted to point out one more thing before we close, that these things are mainly mentioned in anecdotes. So it's really, really important to see that they always try to make you laugh about the fact that the Nazis didn't see it coming, so that the Nazis would help them or whatever. And I think those anecdotes are part of the reason that we don't see what they actually did sometimes, because they make it so small, but they were amazing. And I think I'll conclude with this picture. It's one of the four women you see here. They were part of the board of the student society during the war. And I found this picture like this, but it's supposed to be like this because they were the hiding society. So they were under the table, although their traditional photo would always be behind the table. And they could even laugh about this situation because they were so resilient. To conclude with that.
Thank you
Wow.
very